Hello, everybody. Welcome to our September monthly member call. This is a very special call. As you'll notice, Neeyaz is not here. She is actually doing a very special event this weekend, live speaking in OC. So she's with us in spirit, and we're with her in spirit. But I do have a special guest today joining me, Dr. Titus Chiu, the brilliant and and fun speaker who is here to talk to us about brain health. And if you don't know, he's also my husband and partner. So that's why we're here together in
How did I ever get so lucky?
In our home studio. And today we are talking all about brain health. So those of you who also know his work know that he's a functional neurologist, functional medicine doctor, is also certified in acupuncture. What else? You do lots of things. Nutrition, master's in nutrition.
I learned how to chop wood this year.
You did learn how to chop wood.
Build fires and grill oysters. Professionally. Aspiring to be professional.
Oysters are a big part of his life. So they actually play very well into brain health here. So we're going to dive right in. If you are watching, let us know where you're watching from. The replay will be available for members. And as always, we're going to have special brain healthy recipes and mini guides for you guys in the member portal. But feel free to chime in, leave comments, whether you're on YouTube or Facebook, and let us know. But we're going to dive right in, and we're first going to talk about just what's the difference between a healthy brain and an unhealthy brain.
It's a great question, and there's a lot of ways of looking at that. One of the biggest things I look at
I just realized, sorry.
Comes to, can you guys hear me?
Yeah. Oh, I hope you guys have been able to hear us so far.
Yeah, I've done that before.
I don't know what mic is in right now.
So, and answer your question, healthy versus unhealthy brain. Number one, a good indicator is where did you leave the mic? Is it in the right place? If you left it in the right place, then you got a healthy brain. And another thing I look at whenever I work with patients is brain balance. So just a quick primer. As you guys know, we all have a brain, but the brain is actually made up of two hemispheres. There's the left hemisphere over here, and then the right hemisphere over here. And so I was saying a second ago, when it comes to healthy versus unhealthy brain, I'm looking for balance. Is there balance between the left and right hemispheres? What does that mean? So as an example, the left brain, in general, this is a simplistic way of looking at it, but it's helpful. The left brain is very important for linear types of thinking, like logic and thinking things through sequentially, step by step. Whereas the right brain is more intuitive and more abstract. So it's more the touchy-feely parts of our brain, so to speak. More emotional. Some people say more creative. I disagree. I think you can be very creative with the left hemisphere as well. But that's besides the point. So my point is balance between left and right in, as reflected in your experiences is a great indicator of how healthy your brain is. So for example, a lot of people tend to be, not a lot, but I would say a lot of patients I've worked with tend to be skewed in one direction. So I work with a lot of women who are very sensitive. And what I've found is there's many reasons for that, right? But one reason in terms of brain health and brain balance is that I find that the right hemisphere of their brain, the right side of their brains, tends to be more overactive and dominant, very strong. What does that look like? You'll be more sensitive to sensations. I find a lot of women I work with who have a stronger right brain, they're very empathetic too. They're very in tune with their own feelings. And that's the first step to then have empathy and compassion for others. So, but interesting enough, we can actually, we can boil it down on one level to a dominant and very strong right hemisphere. But again, going back to the original question, healthy versus unhealthy, the key is balance. So many situations I find patients and clients I work with, if it tends to become too dominant, then everything becomes overwhelming, and the whole thing with feeling sensitive and So emotions become overwhelming. The lights or sounds or smells are overwhelming, or sensations like are overwhelming. That's again because the right hemisphere has become overactive. And so the key then is balance. So, and that's just one, example of that.
I remember when I started learning about this too. I don't know if this I didn't realize the microphone was plugged in, so I'll just move it around. I know when I started learning about this, I saw the list of like left brain functions and right brain functions. And, again, left brain is like more logical, detail oriented, all of that sort of stuff. And the right brain is a lot more feely, big picture, like Dr. Titus was talking about. And I sort of felt like a little bit alarmed or worried about balancing my brain because I always identified as being a creative, right-brained, feely type person, even though I had, some left brain skills as well, being logical and, good at math and that sort of stuff. But I sort of started to think, well, if I start balancing my brain, then I'm going to lose parts of my personality that I really like. And that was like kind of scary and upsetting to me. But then I find out that's not really how it works. It's more about having options and the ability to access it. So talk a little bit about that too, like optimizing the brain and things like that.
So yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point you bring up there, because that's one misconception misperception people have about that is if you start to balance and exercise and strength in one area, that the other areas start to go south, and that's typically not the case, especially if you already are really good at those things I described a second ago, like the more right brain functions of empathy and creativity and intuition, which a lot of it can be found in the right hemisphere of the brain. So, but the thing is, you actually said, I'll lose a lot of things that I enjoy or like about myself. What I tend to see in patients I work with, like those things are so tipped out of balance that they actually, again, can become overwhelming, right? So it's like the intuition or the compassion and empathy, being really in tune with that in others. What ends up happening, and I'm sure you've experienced this, I know we've talked about it, where it becomes overwhelming. You're like, well, I don't know where I start or end and this other person that I care about. And so that's the key again, when you find and are able to create balance between the different hemispheres, then it's like the things that you like about yourself or you enjoy, you can actually enjoy them even more without having the opposite effect, right? So in terms of being able to empathize with others, but not being lost in those emotions as well.
Yeah, and I think that, just really basically, we're giving you guys a big picture view of all this functional neurology stuff, but there's the two hemispheres, but then there's also different lobes of the brain. So some of the major lobes that Dr. Titus talks a lot about, he's going to walk you through just kind of the basic functions of them, but we'll go through maybe the top 5 really quickly. And then, we'll talk about the functions of them and then get to what that looks like in your life and how we can use food, supplements, mind, body exercises to optimize the brain. So what would you say are the top 5?
I love your pants, by the way.
The top 5 lobes of the brain.
The top 5. I mean, there's so many lobes that I absolutely love, but I'll just stick to the theme of our conversation. In terms of empathy, one of the big areas that is involved in the experience of empathy is what we call the insular cortex. And that's actually not part of any specific lobe. We can't actually pull it up here, but let me just show you the hemisphere of the brain. So this is the outer covering. And the main lobes of the brain, the front part is what we call the frontal lobe. And then over here on the side is the parietal lobe. Back here is the occipital lobe. And finally, we have the temporal lobe. So those are the major lobes of the brain. So if we were to actually scoop out or tease apart, like spread this apart and look deep within, that's where we find the insular cortex. And that's one of the areas that's actually involved in empathy and compassion. And the interesting thing is it's also involved with sensations of what's happening inside our bodies, in particular our viscera, our guts. So like our heart or our digestive system. And again, it's interesting because I find a lot of women I work with who are more sensitive, like I described a second ago, they tend to have these really intense internal sensations as well, like maybe sometimes they've had a long history of like irritable bowel syndrome, and they thought it was a food they're eating, but it turned out it was because it was overactivity of that area of their brain, right? And so that's one key area, especially when we talk about sensitivity, is the insular cortex.
And I think, yeah, you bring up a really great point about like gut health and the brain's function in that, because we're talking about healthy and unhealthy brains here. And a lot of times people have like a lot of symptoms in their gut and they don't think it's at all related to their brain. So they're always like trying to address it with food or supplements or things that are just like going straight into their gut. But because of these connections, you can also use these mind-body practices that we're going to talk about on the second half of this call to help the gut.
Yeah, exactly. It's really, I think the brain is one of the missing pieces in a lot of chronic health challenges. Just like you said, with IBS, people used to think that, oh, I have digestive symptoms, it must be my gut. So I'll change my diet, I'll take supplements, I'll run a stool test. And that's part of the picture. But number one, like I said a second ago, the actual perception of your gut, what's going on in your gut, happens in your brain. So it's just a wild idea that, scientists and researchers are starting to understand. And then, it's still light years ahead from seeing that, the applications when you go to your doctor, you talk to your physician to get those different practices to shift that. But the cool thing is there are ways of shifting that through what we call neuroplasticity. So there's specific things that you can do to, even if your brain feels like it's out of balance, like I described, there's things you can do to help balance it and then have a more calm experience of life. So that's one of the top lobes. And I'm actually going to go over just 3 for sake of time. So the insular cortex is a really important area of the nervous system when it comes to sensitivity. The other area of the nervous system is what we call the limbic system. And the limbic system refers to a collection of different regions of your brain that help you process emotions, right? And it gives you a coloring of your emotional state. So one area is we call the amygdala, which deals with, like survival and survival-based instincts. Another area that's related to the limbic system is what we call the hippocampus. And I can actually show you guys where that is. So a second ago, I showed you the outer portion, the temporal lobe. And when we flip it around, on the inside portion of the temporal lobe is what we call the hippocampus. And that deals with memory and memory recall. As you guys know, in terms of emotions or even trauma, a lot of the memories that we recall, like traumatic memories, are actually stored, or at least initially stored, in the hippocampus, and require, in order for you to remember these things, you have to activate that area too. But the flip side of that is the really good things in life are also processed there as well, not just the traumatic ones. So anyways, that area, the limbic system, is very important in terms of sensitivity that we were describing. So the first one, the insular cortex; the second one, the limbic system. And finally, the third one is this region of the nervous system that I think is very overlooked when it comes to even neurological symptoms, is what we call the brainstem. And so here, again, the outer covering of the brain. So if we were to put it in my actual head, that's what it would look like. And then down here would be the spinal cord, which controls all your muscles. And then you get sensations coming in, telling your body what's going on in your arms and legs, etc. That rides up the spinal cord. But in between the brain and the spinal cord sits your brainstem right here. So I'm going to pop it out. I'll show you the inside. I'm going to pop it out here. The brainstem is one of the most under-recognized areas when it comes to brain symptoms. So things like brain fog or anxiety or sensitivity or having a really strong stress response. That is actually a function of the brainstem. And so the brainstem is in charge of your digestion. It's in charge of your blood pressure, your pulse, right? What we call the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic fight or flight. So when you feel stressed, versus the parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest and heal. So I find that people who tend to be really sensitive usually have overreactions in the brainstem, especially the top part. And so you might be really sensitive to lights or sounds, or, you know, if you hear a door close in your home and you jump up and you get startled, that typically shows that, or that's a clue that your brainstem is overactive. So those are the three areas again: the insular cortex, number one; number two, the limbic system; and finally, the brainstem. For areas of the nervous system, I usually find that are related to sensitivity. And so the good news is, like I said, the brain is remarkable in the fact that it can actually, through our experiences, can change, right? Through our specific daily habits, as well as intentional practices, and even gentle advanced treatments, we can literally change and rewire the nervous system. So if you felt really overwhelmed in life, right, or chronically stressed or anxious, a lot of that is a reflection of what's happening within the nervous system. But the good news is, like I said, through proper intention, and when you can get to the root cause, there's so much that can be done about that.
Yeah, definitely. And there's all kinds of things that we can do holistically. And Dr. Chiu is a specialist at really targeting where areas of whether it's the hemispheres, the different lobes, the networks of how your brain communicates with the rest of your body. And there's a couple different approaches that we want to dive into. So we're going to get to really specifically how to exercise different regions that he talked about. But first, you know, I know people always love to talk about food and even supplements and herbs and things like that. And I know from, you know, being in this world that usually the food is going to have like a big global impact on our brain and our body. So what are things that can overall help our brain health in terms of the foods we eat, or supplements that like the top brain supplements?
Sure. So when it comes to brain health, there's certain foods you want to eat and there's certain foods you want to avoid. So the top 3 foods that you want to eat are healthy fats. So things like olive oil, coconut oil, medium chain triglycerides, which are found in high amounts in coconut oil. For people who don't have sensitivities to dairy, ghee is a fantastic source of healthy fats as well. But a lot of people do, including myself, and I know you. So we try to avoid ghee. So yeah, those are some examples of healthy fats, as well as like avocado oil, healthy fats from fish, right? Fish oils.
What do you say to like people who are fatophobic and are just like, oh, fat is bad for me, or it's going to give me a heart attack or a stroke? How can, you know, we start to really understand, because there is a lot of research and science around fat being healthy and essential, and what's the difference of like the good fats versus the bad fats?
Yeah, great question. So the thing is, there's so much misconception when it comes to fat, because if you just say fat is bad for you, which we've been taught for so many years, I mean, that's such a generalization, because there's so many different types of fats. There are polyunsaturated fats, monounsaturated fats, saturated fats, there's trans fats, list goes on and on. So we want to be really clear as to what we're talking about. So definitely trans fats is one of the foods that you want to avoid. So trans fats are found in a lot of highly processed foods, and a lot of, especially like baked goods that you find in the grocery store that are prepackaged.
Like long shelf life?
Yeah, that gives it the long shelf life. Margarine, super high in trans fats. But when it comes to the healthy fats, it's everything I was describing. There's a lot of really healthy monounsaturated fats. Did you guys know that chicken and chicken skin actually is really high, not in saturated fats, but monounsaturated fats? And that's actually really good for you and good for your immune system and your brain, believe it or not. So those are, you know, the top one is healthy fats, right? The second food that you want to eat more of are foods that have really bright and, you know, dark, rich colors. Mm-hmm. So things like blueberries, things like dark chocolate, green tea. Drinking cups of green tea is really good too, because those colors, those are because of these plant compounds found in all these foods we call polyphenols, and they're very protective for your mitochondria, which is essential for brain function. And it's also really important for decreasing any inflammation, which is, your brain cells are very sensitive to things like inflammation. So anything you can do to decrease inflammation would be fantastic. So food, like my motto is eat from the rainbow. not the Skittles rainbow, but the rainbow in the produce section of your grocery store. So that's the second one. And finally, the third food that you want to eat more of are healthy, clean protein sources. So choose, like if you eat meat, choose organic as much as possible, grass-fed. And if you're a vegan or vegetarian, again, choose organic and vary up the different protein sources as much as possible, because proteins are essential building blocks for what we call neurotransmitters. Again, and there's a lot of neurotransmitters, but when we talk about the limbic system, when it comes to mood, when it comes to emotional stability, that's really, really important. So clean, healthy sources. So again, to summarize, healthy fats, eat from the rainbow, and clean protein.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think a lot of people, standard American diet too, there's a lot of like white processed foods, like Wonder Bread that we grew up eating, and, all of that stuff that really lacks that like vibrancy that he's talking about. And yeah, the artificial colors and those sort of things, these are some of the stuff that we want to avoid for, brain health. And I know there's a couple of ones that are biggies, especially if people have had a concussion or any sort of like brain issues, memory issues. What are 3 things that people should avoid for brain health?
Sure. So the top thing I think that's so common that people eat is gluten. So gluten is a protein found in different types of grain sources like wheat or rye or barley, a lot of delicious foods, but a lot of people I would have to say 99% of the patients I've worked with have a gluten sensitivity, and myself included, and I know you do too. And the thing is, if you have a gluten sensitivity, it can trigger inflammation in your nervous system, leading to anxiety, depression, brain fog. The list goes on and on. So number 1, gluten, right? The second one would be dairy, or rather casein, which is the protein found in dairy sources. So again, and there's actually research showing that casein, if you have a sensitivity to casein, it can actually create an immune response against your nervous system and brain cells. So yeah, it's no joke, and that's the thing. These foods, gluten and dairy, I absolutely ate them growing up, and I absolutely love them. And it was hard to like shift those behaviors, but after suffering for so many years, and then kind of going back and forth between that, it's just not worth it for me anymore. So yeah, I would have to say the second one is dairy, and in particular, casein is can be really damaging to the nervous system. And finally, number 3, what I said earlier, trans fats, terrible for brain health, because the fats you eat from the foods you eat actually get incorporated into the cell membranes. Your brain cells have this covering we call a membrane. Those fats get inserted into the membrane. And the thing is, when you break it down, again, that's what I was saying earlier, you have to be really clear as to what you're talking about when you're talking about fat, because all the different fats that I described, mono, polyunsaturated, saturated, trans, they have different chemical properties. And in the context of what I'm saying now, trans fats, they're very rigid, right? So how many of you guys out there have seen like a stick of margarine and then a stick of butter? What's going to happen if you leave the butter overnight, especially if it's kind of warm or even room temperature? What happens? The stick of butter gets a bit soft. What'll happen to that margarine? It's going to stay rock solid until you heat it way up. So my point is, when you eat that trans fat, it gets stuck into your cell membranes and it becomes really rigid. And the cell membrane is one of the areas that allows for brain communication. So what ends up happening, communication in your brain starts to go south. You can experience things like anxiety, depression, even research looking at things like inflammation. Trans fat could contribute to things more serious like autoimmune disease like MS or Alzheimer's. So that's for that reason, trans fats is in my top 3 foods to avoid for brain health.
Definitely. And then I think, some of the obvious ones too, that we can expand this list quite a bit, but like those artificial colors you mentioned, like the Skittles, right? Anytime I pick up a label of something and it has like Red 30, or I don't even know what they're called, but any of those.
There's so many.
Yeah.
There's so many. Yeah, don't eat that rainbow of the yellow 46 and the red 39. Yeah.
Stuff that's like legitimately synthesized in a lab. And I mean, there's a lot of things that we could go on and talk about, but I think those have been pivotal for us, our clients, people who have chronic conditions, brain issues, autoimmunity, thyroid disorders. And like you said, there's that potential to cross-react with like dairy and your brain tissue, or gluten and like your thyroid tissue, which we talk about often. So it's important to think about how those foods are really contributing to inflammation. And then, we really like to personalize supplements. We're not like people who just take like random, Centrum multi every day, and the high quality supplements too. But what are some of the top supplements that people, maybe need because our soils are depleted, or they're not getting it in their diet, or it's just an excellent way for them to kind of boost on top of their healthy diets that they're eating?
Yeah, great question. So when I look at supplements in brain health, there's like basic foundational supplements, and then there's the more intermediate, and then that speaks to more, personalization, and finally the advanced that we can actually target through testing, right? So in terms of foundational supplements, like I said a second ago, one of the best ones is docosahexaenoic acid and EPA eicosapentaenoic acid, found in high amounts in fish oils, as well as algae oil for you vegans out there. So super important. I mean, you know me, I eat seafood pretty much every day. And I also take fish oils. So that's huge one, especially if you don't eat seafood very often, or if the seafood you eat is mainly farm sources, because a lot of the fish that's farm sources, unfortunately, are fed grains, which are very high in omega-6 fats, and that is typically a fat that you do want to avoid. So that being said, DHA, EPA, or fish oils, or algae oil. So that's a big one. And another one is polyphenol formulation. That's actually what I was saying a second ago, eating from the rainbow. So every day I take this supplement. It's a blend of pterostilbene, resveratrol, curcumin, these other plant compounds that are found in fruits and vegetables. But I take those every single day because, the world we live in is, sadly, it's toxic, and we live fairly stressful lives. So it's really important for me to get a hold. One of the biggest root causes for the symptoms I've struggled with in my life are brain inflammation. So I take that supplement every day, even though, I tend to eat from the rainbow as much as possible. I drink green tea. I drink organic coffee at times, really high in polyphenols. So that's the second one. And the third foundational supplement, I would have to say, I would say B vitamins. B vitamins are really important, not only for immune function, as well as like detoxification and the whole what we call methylation, homocysteine pathways, glutathione production. But B vitamins are also really important to help you create neurotransmitters, which I said a second ago, really important for your limbic system, as well as all the different areas of your brain. So B vitamins, I would say, is number 3. So foundational, I mean, if I were to limit it to 3, I would actually say a multi, because that'll have some B. But then there's some intermediate and advanced supplements. One that I've been taking that I absolutely love, that I started recently, is lion's mane, which is it's a mushroom, actually. It's a wild, we were looking at a picture of it the other day, wild looking bushy mushroom, right? And it's been shown to help increase neuroplasticity and nerve growth factor to help strengthen brain cells. And for me, I just feel absolutely fantastic. But we do know people who are more sensitive, especially when you start playing around with herbs or mushrooms, if you've never tried lion's mane or things like that, you want to go slow and steady to make sure you don't have a adverse reaction to that. And that being said, just to make sure that you guys are clear, I am a brain specialist, but I'm not your brain specialist. So be sure to check with your doctor first before starting any new protocols. And with that disclaimer, we can continue.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, we've had this conversation, researched it a lot too. I think a lot of people watching may be from the autoimmune community, a really sensitive community. And there is some, reactions that happen based from lion's mane specifically, not so much the other medicinal mushrooms, but the lion's mane is really fantastic for brain health, but it could potentially have adverse effects for people who have autoimmunity. So it's really case by case. That one in particular is really potent, but it's one that you want to work with a professional.
Exactly.
You know, and the medicinal mushrooms are all really amazing. But I think that's such a powerful, potent one that you should work with a professional to really see if it's best fit for you.
Definitely. In general, the mushrooms are fantastic, but they all have immune stimulating properties. So
especially with herbs, like herbs in general, I think having an herbalist or a professional who really understands that is important, because we know this with the immune system too. You don't want to always just like increase the immune system activity. You want to modulate it and match it to where your body is. With the brain.
And so if you don't have a practitioner to work with and you're interested in experimenting on your own, like I said, go slow and steady, especially if you are sensitive. It's in anything, whether it's brain exercises or mushrooms or herbs or anything that's new, it's good to go slow and steady.
I think those are some really great recommendations, that the fish oils or the algae oils, to make sure that you have that good fat, that EPA, DHA. And secondly was the polyphenols, which are a lot of stuff you can get in food too, but you can also concentrate it to boost, like the green tea and the the blueberries and the resveratrol, and then the B vitamins, which you mentioned. So those are some really great ones. And just want to check in here. We've got Heather watching. Heather says, great to see both of you. Oh my goodness.
Good to see you too, Heather. Welcome. Good to see you. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, Heather says, good to see both of you. Excellent presentation as always. We love having you here, Heather. And if you guys are watching, let us know where you're watching from. If you have questions, if they can fit into what we're talking about. Otherwise, we have Q&A time at the end where we'll get to all of that. So moving on from food and supplements, we're going to dive into, I think, maybe one of the more, I don't know if it's more fun, but the, interesting categories where we talk about mind practices for brain health. And I know you have an online course that really dives into a lot of these not just mindset, but things that we can do from the top down of our mind to really impact our body. So give us some of your favorite mind practices that help improve brain health.
Sure. So I remember when I first had this insight, it's like, because I had a concussion many years ago and I was trying to heal my brain from it. And I had this realization that, oh my goodness, I can use my mind to help heal my brain. And just to create the distinction is I look at the brain as like, it's like this organ, it processes sensations, it helps us think and move around. But the mind is this other like higher consciousness that we can actually engage and help to heal the brain. So some of my favorite mind practices are obviously the practice of gratitude, and I'm sure everyone's heard of that before. And I heard it for many years, but it wasn't until I committed to a practice of doing it, a gratitude journal at first. And then now what I do every time I wake up in the morning, I think of at least one thing I'm grateful for. And oh my goodness, it's changed my life. And that's the thing, again, the beauty of neuroplasticity. Through our mind practices and our thoughts, we can really start to shape our realities and our experiences. It's truly remarkable. That's one of my deepest passions, is exploring that.
Yeah.
So that's a really important
one. I think like within psychoneuroimmunology and all that, there's all this research around how gratitude is really anti-inflammatory and all this stuff. Can you explain to us a little bit, maybe neurologically or physiologically, why gratitude practices have a bigger impact than just saying, oh, I'm just being happier or, looking on the bright side of things?
Yeah. So I think gratitude, like you said, has all these like proven benefits, but one of the areas of the nervous system that actually activates is what we said earlier, the limbic system. So that's one area that becomes like strengthened through the gratitude practices. And another thing is when it comes to gratitude practice, here's a pro tip for you guys. If you don't actually do it and you want to, not only is it important to think about something you're grateful for, but it's really important to actually feel it and embody it. Because when you do that, you actually engage the heart and the emotional intelligence within the heart. And it's crazy, even though I'm a brain geek and specialist, there's actually more communication going up from the heart to the brain than there is down. So when you start to feel those and embody the experience of gratitude, that's when we start to shift, the areas of the nervous system that are stuck in the fight or flight, like we talked about a second ago, like the brainstem or the limbic system and the amygdala in particular. And the thing is, though, if you're getting started with it and you try and you can't even think of anything that you're grateful for because you're not in a good place, and we've all been there, even the act of thinking about it and searching for it starts to break that cycle. So don't get discouraged if you've tried it before and you're like, oh, this doesn't work, just get started. Even the mere, sitting down and trying to do it begins to break, that cycle. And then, like I said, a pro tip is not only thinking about it, but really embracing that feeling of it as much as possible. So that's one of my top ones. But when I have to say, when it comes to mind practices for brain health, I think one of the most important, tools that we all have the ability to develop is awareness, right? Because so much of my life was run by these negative thoughts, and the negative thoughts are still there, but because I developed these awareness practices, I became aware of those negative thoughts, and I was able to not let myself get carried away by them, right? So it's like, first, like, becoming aware of them is so important. So I actually think that's the first step, right? Is becoming aware of these negative thoughts that we all have, that we all struggle with. And in the past, they just ran my life and ended, I'd end up in dark places in my mind or in my life that I didn't want to be in. And so, but I think the first step for me is just becoming aware of those thoughts. And then the second one was not feeling ashamed of them. Because I think a lot of people are like, okay, I'm aware of my thoughts now. And, oh my God, I have these thoughts. What's wrong with me? It's like that what's wrong with me part of your brain. It's like, it's looking at that what's wrong with me thought, and then it creates this deeper cycle. So the first step is awareness, but then the second step is being gentle with yourself and then having compassion for yourself. Is like, hey, we all have these negative thoughts and it's okay. So I think those mind practices really shifted, my brain health, but really just my experience of life in a good direction.
I think the compassion practices and the gratitude practices are really related in that sense. I know you talked about like that insular cortex, and people who are really sensitive and empathic and all of that, they experience that kind of compassion in that area, but they also experience the suffering or like the dark thoughts and the pain there too. So it's kind of really related there when you start tapping into what you're grateful for and having compassion for other people's suffering and all of that. It sort of all works together.
Yeah, it's really interesting because the more and more I study the brain and the more I have these life experiences, you're absolutely right. It's the saying that you can't really have a deep experience of life either way without like the deep suffering, right? So before I had the concussion and went through all the breakdowns and the darkness, hit rock bottom. Before I went through that, I kind of was coasting through life just kind of like this, right? And so it's like the highs weren't very high, the lows weren't very low. But when I went through that and through the concussion and concussion recovery, and I came out of it, it's like I just have this much deeper appreciation for life and for myself and for others. And the interesting thing is, just like you said, when you look at it neurologically, the areas of your brain that allow for compassion and empathy, and there are also the areas of the brain that process suffering. So it's neuroplasticity within the anterior cingulate gyrus and within the actual insular cortex that allows us. It's almost like a skill. And that's the interesting thing. We all can develop that skill. Hopefully you guys won't have to get hit by a car and then lose your mind and then struggle for many years for you to develop empathy. I think the majority of you guys out there probably already have that. Maybe it's more about shifting then into the left side of the brain and being able to have good boundaries for yourself and others. But for me, it was the opposite, just being like breaking open that right hemisphere for me, that, and actually going back to what you said earlier, that fear is like, oh, if I, work on the left brain, if I'm more right brain dominant or, be more logical, research shows, and one of the definitions of genius is actually not only having balance between the left and right brains, right? It's not having balance between the two. So for example, for me, probably, most of my life I was more left brain dominant, and I wasn't really in tune with this part, but because all my brains broke, right? And then I had to like heal it when I was able to create that balance. But then from there, genius is defined as the integration between the two hemispheres, right? I mean, there's a lot of different ways to, define genius. Like there's different types of genius as well. But one definition of it is like, how can you like communicate between those two areas? So that's just a little tangent, but I think it's really relevant to what we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, and I've also kind of from a different perspective heard a lot about that ability to kind of use both hemispheres or jump between them as an asset for creativity, like people who are highly creative and just inspired, which, you can also use as a synonym for being kind of a genius.
Creative genius.
And then finally, for the last mind practice before we move on, because I know this is such a important one that you teach people and also is free and available to everyone. But what are mini breaks and why are they important?
Yeah, so mini breaks are exactly what it sounds like, taking little mini small breaks throughout your day, especially when you're using a lot of brain power. And when I mean brain power, it could be like if you're focusing on a project or your work and really crunching numbers or all the gears are going in your brain, that could be brain power. But in addition, it could be things like having emotional, intense conversations. That's also brain power, but it's a different part of your brain. Like I said, the limbic system. So it's so important because especially in our modern world and society, and especially now with, the pandemic and everyone going virtual, and social media and all these things, we're just bombarded constantly with stimulation, right? And where our brains are just always going, right? I think especially more today than ever within human history, right? At least as we know, chronicled human history. That's another conversation for another time, aka Atlantis. Anyways, just playing. So my point is, it's really important to disengage with that part of our brains that's always doing. It's actually, we call the central executive network. It's an area of the nervous system that helps us stay focused and on point and, complete tasks. Where when you take a mini break, you disengage from that and you activate another area of your nervous system we call the default mode network. And part of that's actually this area we call the vagus nerve. So when you activate the default mode network, you activate your vagus nerve, which then shifts you from that always going and doing fight or flight response to the one of resting, digesting, and healing. And so mini breaks are a great way to disengage. And the way you do it is simple. Like say you're on the computer for a certain amount of time. You're going to notice after a while, your eyes might start to glaze over, or you might feel a bit tired, or you yawn, you get a little fidgety. Yeah, maybe even symptomatic, you get headaches. That's a clue that it's time for a mini break, because that one neural network we talked about has become overactive and it's starting to poop out, right? It's starting to get tired. So by stepping away from whatever you're doing, whether it's reading or you're on the computer, or anything requiring mental energy, and doing something that doesn't require any brain power. So what I do, I'll go out and I'll water our garden, because I'm on the computer all day, every day with clients and patients and, creating educational resources. And so I'll just step out. You'll see me go out like throughout the day, just go out and water our garden, because it doesn't require much mental energy for me at all. And it's nice to be outside and whatever. Or I might just go and do some dishes, anything that doesn't require mental energy or that doesn't trigger stress, right? Another example of a mini break could be just lying down or closing your eyes if you feel overstimulated, right? The point is, it shouldn't take much effort mentally, and it shouldn't be stressful for you. And that's a great way, because I find that most of us, and myself included, are guilty of this. In modern society, we tend to go, do for ourselves, for others, and we then crash. And then we need to take a weekend retreat or a month-long sabbatical from life, right? So the good news is you don't have to wait I've done that already and I've crashed. You don't have to do with what Dr. Chiu has done before you start giving back to yourself. So these mini breaks are a fantastic way of just giving yourself that little break from life, right? And allow the healing processes to happen, or at the very least, just clear the static from your mind.
Yeah. I mean, we're in a chronically fatigued, chronically exhausted, chronically stressed society, time in human history, all of these sort of things. And, I think this is such an important point. Why I brought it up is these mini breaks, because I think that idea of rest, a lot of times we only associate that with physical rest, where we're like, well, I'm not lifting heavy things, or I'm just laying on the couch all day. But if you're laying on the couch scrolling and there's lights coming in and there's information coming in, that's not actually rest. So if you do that all weekend and then you feel exhausted Monday, you haven't really rested. You haven't taken a mini break or an extended break from this kind of stimulation and brain function. And
and if you do it, that's the thing. Back when we, we had a full office in Berkeley and we were seeing patients all day, every day, I would go back to back with patients for like 8 hours and then do like catch-up work, like paperwork, for another 4 hours afterward. You saw me. It was just like, I was able to do that, but it was because I overrode my intuition of like, okay, I need a break because I triggered a stress response. And I think a lot of us go through that. We can go what's the word? We can blaze past and kind of power through. And sometimes that's needed. But if you do that for weeks, months, or years on end, something's going to break. So that's the thing. Something's going to burn out. And so, and I did that for many years. And so what I've learned along the way is like, it doesn't have to be that extreme, by taking these small little mini breaks, one step at a time, it could be a game changer for you, as it is for me, honestly.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot you can do nutritionally. You can do mindset, mental mind practices. And now my favorite category is the body work.
Oh yeah, mine too.
Yeah. So moving into our favorite, we're gonna, wrap up the 15 minutes of this call with your guys' questions, but we're gonna dive into, this body work, which is the juiciest part. So don't leave us yet. But we got Sheila here saying, thank you so much for sharing this information. Thank you for being here. And we're going into the juicy stuff now. So we have.
Oh, we're breaking out the oysters?
No.
She's so sweet. She bought me oysters.
I'm sure we have oysters in the fridge right now.
I finished them with your dad yesterday.
So body work is one of the most powerful ways of accessing our nervous system and helping change our brain, not just like how we feel emotionally, but actually changing the structures of our brain. And exercise has always been applauded as this great way for brain health. And it's true, you're activating your own muscles, you're getting blood flow, all of that information, proprioception into your brain. But what we're going to talk about right now is targeted, both do it yourself and with practitioners, body work exercises that actually really help the brain. And the big buzzword is the vagus nerve and vagal tone. So we're going to let Dr. Chiu tell us all about what is vagal tone, why is it important, and why is it such a hot topic these days? Because everybody needs it and they can access it for free at home.
Yeah, great question. So when we talk about the vagus nerve, I already alluded to one of the reasons why it's so important, because it's connected with this other neural network called the default mode network that's important for creativity and insight and healing. And so the vagus nerve is one aspect of that default mode network and a very powerful access point to shift from the fight or flight, sympathetic, just go, go, go response to the one of resting, digesting, and healing. And so it's interesting because, when most people think about body work and most people think about the brain, they're like, there's just like, what's the correlation here, right? And I'm sure a lot of people on this call have heard of the mind-body connection, but there's also
the MindBody Club.
Exactly, of course, duh. But have you heard? There's also the body-mind connection, and that refers to there's all these sensory pathways from our muscles, our joints, our eyes, nose, mouth, ears, toes, and everything in between that send signals to specific regions of our nervous system. So, meaning when you go get that Thai massage or that Swedish massage, there's specific areas of your brain that become activated, right? And so body work, not only, if you actually look at, you talked to a lot of bodywork practitioners that are really advanced, not only are there access points on the actual body, but there's access points on the eyeballs as well. And that's what connecting us to the vagus nerve. So one of the most powerful exercises that I do for myself and that I actually do as a mini break is what's called palming. This is a palming exercise where you take the palms of your hands, right, the fleshy part of your palms, and you gently close your eyes and put them right over your eyeballs. So I invite everyone here, especially if you've been on this call, it's been about an hour, join us for a little palming exercise. So just gentle pressure over your closed eyelids. I absolutely love this because it's, you know, when you're on the screen and you've been on the screen all day or on a computer or whatever on your phone and you do this, it just takes away that visual stimuli, right? Because there's just so much like light pollution happening these days, overwhelm. But the cool thing is not only does it clear out that visual static, the gentle pressure actually activates your vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve, like I said, is this access point to help shift you from the fight or flight to the rest and digest response.
So we'll have a picture of all of this and the vagus nerve in the mini guide and the portal for all the members to see. But the vagus nerve, tell us a little bit about it. It's the cranial nerve, and where does it go? Where does it connect?
Sure. Where's my little brainstem? So the brainstem is the area we were talking about earlier, one of the top 3 areas of the nervous system. And so the vagus nerve is one of 12 cranial nerves. Cranial nerve is the bridge between your brainstem and other areas of your body, like, for example, to control your eye movements, to control the size of your pupils, the diameter of your blood vessels, as well as, believe it or not, gastric motility, right? So that's why, again, we were talking about earlier about people with chronic gut problems. It could be a brain issue or partly a brain issue. So anyways, the vagus nerve is the 10th cranial nerve that sits at the base of the brainstem. And this area we call the pontomedullary junction. And so the pons is this little part here that pops out here. And then the medulla is the bottom part of the brainstem. And the top part is what we call the midbrain. And so this pontomedullary junction is where the brain cells where the vagus nerve starts, they sit here. That's where their home is that the pontomedullary junction. And then there's the actual vagus nerve itself is kind of like a telephone wire that connects to these different regions of your body, in particular your viscera, right? Your heart as well as your gut. And so that's what the cranial nerve is, the vagus nerve, and that's where it lives.
It's like a big pathway, right? And it goes to all these organs, and it can help control breathing, like respiration, secretions, even like bile and all those like secretions.
Digestive enzymes, HCl, all that's coordinated by the brainstem, the vagus nerve, and other areas of the nervous system.
And it also innervates part of our face, right? Like the physical parts, like our throat and our ears and stuff.
And the eyeballs.
Yeah. So this is how Dr. Chiu is, helping us understand through complex neurology that because of this highway that's connected in all these places, when you activate one part of that, roadmap, you're sending a signal through the whole system, right? And so the eyeballs, the light pressure on the eyeballs is why it's activating that whole pathway that's also connected to the gut. Enzyme secretions, like respiration, heart rate, all of that sort of stuff.
Who would have thunk? The body is a miracle, right?
Yeah, and a lot of these practices are built into traditional medicine and like thousands-year-old practices, right? Like yoga, breath work, all of that, where they're finding now that a lot of the mechanism under why deep breathing and chanting and things like that actually help us in terms of our health and our brain and all of that is
that palming exercise, I did not invent it. It was actually created by ancient Tibetan yogis to help clear mental static. So, but just like you said, I love looking at these esoteric ancient practices through the lens of neurology, because then we can get really specific as to what would benefit me or you or our audience out there and my patients. Because once you can really understand what's going on with a person and creating their experience, whether it's symptoms or whether a good experience, then we can continue to do these specific things to help heal symptoms and health challenges, and do things to help further promote the things that are positive for a person.
Yeah. So besides palming, what else can people do at home that will help activate their vagus nerve and help put them in parasympathetic mode?
So chanting is a fantastic one, like you mentioned. There's different. Recently I was in Sedona, at one of the most beautiful places I've seen, Chapel of the Holy Cross. If you guys haven't been there, I highly recommend it, or at least check out the images. It was in part designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, and it was just this gorgeous, gorgeous chapel built on these natural rock formations. It was absolutely beautiful. And I was so inspired and overwhelmed and in awe that I just sat in the car with the windows open. It was like 100 degrees out, and I was listening to some Gregorian chants. It was wild, because when I was doing that was before I went into the chapel. I was just totally like taking a mini break, activating my default mode network, and just totally blissed out listening to this music. It was crazy. And then when I didn't go into the chapel yet, and when I actually went up and into the chapel, guess what they were playing?
Same thing.
The Gregorian chants. I'm like, okay, I'm on the right path. I'm on the right path. So anyways, chanting is a fantastic way of activating the vagus nerve. If you're not a Gregorian monk, don't worry. You could do, there's the sacred tone of Om. One of my favorite toning practices or chants it's not even a chant, it's what we call toning, is what we call, or is just making the sound of ah. So I like, almost like a sigh, but you can extend it outwards. And that's a fantastic way I found to activate the diaphragm, which then activates your vagus nerve. And I just feel so in tune, right, with myself. And that's what I really believe is, like, I'm talking on this neurology and default mode networks and pathways. I firmly believe that when we're able to create that space in our lives, right, by activating the vagus nerve and the default mode network, that's when we're most inspired. And that's what the science says too, but that's when we're really in touch with our intuition and our higher selves and higher powers, if you believe in that, right? Yeah. And that's been my experience. So try it. And you'd be like, you know what, Dr. Chiu, I tried that, and all I did was got a sore throat. So if that's you, drink some honey with some tea, lemon tea, and try again.
Yeah, chanting, and I think singing also, right? Like for people who actually enjoy singing or are good at it. But for me, I'd rather do like a humming or a chanting.
Yeah, I love it. I always hear you humming around the house. I'm like, yes, she's activating her default mode network.
Yeah, but I think the idea is, again, it's the innervation there, and you're activating these muscles and, the pathways back there. So that's a really big part. So the eyeballs, the throat, all of those sort of things. And I want to talk about one more DIY vagus exercise before we get to questions here, because we have some questions from people. So as we get to the end of this hour, what's a third one? Maybe belly massage or like
belly massage?
Yeah. What else?
I'm gonna say enemas.
Okay, enema. Really? That is a great one.
Enema, believe it or not, is one of the best brain training vagus nerve exercises out there, because when you do an enema, not only does it clear out the gut, right, and the toxins in there, but the stretch from the water in your colon powerfully triggers a vagus nerve response. So again, if you've never done an enema before, talk to a physician who can safely walk you through that. But that is a really powerful one. I haven't done one in years. So we're gonna have to order an enema kit. Okay. We're gonna have an enema viewing party. We're gonna have an enema virtual retreat. So if you're interested, sign up brainsave.com/enema. Just kidding.
So we're gonna.
But maybe if there's enough interest
in the member portal, we're
She's
gonna
just
have
like, oh my
more.
Goodness, I regret getting this guy out.
We're gonna have our vagal nerve exercises that you guys can do at home. A lot more of them, like a whole list of them, and you can get information on that. But we're gonna go to
laughter. Laughter is a very powerful. It activates all the good pathways, all the good stuff.
It is. I like laughter and joy. So we have a question here from Nicole. Hi Nicole. She says, thanks you guys for this great presentation. Any tips on how to support the brain to improve sleep health? And Heather is chiming in saying that is a great question, Nicole. So What would you say to Nicola? What are things that they can do, mind practices, body practices, supplements, anything in holistically to help with sleep and sleep health?
Yeah, great question. My response to that, to anyone who asks, like, how can I improve this sleep or brain fog, is number one, you got to figure out what the root cause is for you, because there can be a lot of reasons why you're not sleeping well. Three of the most common ones. Number one are blood sugar imbalances. If your blood sugar levels drop too low at night, your brain will wake you up because it sees it as an emergency. So if that's the case for you, then eating some healthy fat, maybe a tablespoon of almond butter if you don't have sensitivities to it, or some guacamole, or even some raw honey, just a little bit before going to bed can. If you find that helps, then probably for you, blood sugar is the issue. So that's a good way to start.
I like a little spoon of coconut oil, like tiny bit coconut oil mixed with tahini. It's got good fats.
Yummy.
It's got a little protein in there.
Little exotic flavors. Yeah. So if blood sugar is the issue for you, then that should start to help. But then more importantly, you got to continue investigating why is there blood sugar issues. The second most common reason is because of stress, right? So a lot of people, again, in our modern society, we're just stressed out these days for a million different reasons, right? So stress, when you feel stressed, it releases cortisol and adrenaline, and that can really keep you up at night. And typically, if you're having trouble figuring out, is it blood sugar or stress? If you have trouble falling asleep, right, and you just feel restless before going to bed, it's probably the stress thing. So that's really important to address that. If you have trouble if you're able to fall asleep, but you wake up in the middle of the night, and sometimes your mind might be racing, or you gasp for air, or you just feel stressed out, it's probably because of the blood sugar, right? But anyways, if it's the second reason, if it's stress, then before going to bed, create a little buffer in your evening, like some, what I call bookending your days, winding down your evening. Instead of being on your phone or watching TV or reading the news or engaging in intense conversation, right? Think of that as your last mini break for the day, like this buffer. So you can do like gentle stretching or yoga, or listen to, what I love doing is like listening to calming music, or listening to an inspirational audiobook. Inspiration in the sense that it doesnn't like motivate me to do things, but just like a spiritual, spiritual guide or something like that. So that's a fantastic way, if the reason for you is stress, right? And finally,
I think with that too, in our club, like in the past months, Neeyaz has talked a lot about the blue light blocking glasses, those sort of things. So not just getting off your phone, but in the evening, maybe wearing those glasses or turning off all the artificial lights and using candlelight or red light bulbs, actually just installing some of those. So that's part of helping that sleep hygiene, and where your brain is getting the signal that, okay, it's nighttime.
Yeah, exactly. And you see me going around before we go to bed, turning off the lights or dimming them down, because otherwise your brain thinks it's morning, right? So that's the second most common reason I see is stress. First one, blood sugar issues. And finally, the third one that I see is actually related to the brainstem, right? And related to, again, what we talked about earlier, an overactivation of the sympathetic nervous system, not because of your adrenal glands, but because your brainstem is stuck in the on position, creating this chronic constant state of stress. And so I find that the practices that I just described a second ago, like the bookending your day, your evenings, and gentle yoga, can help. But if you're stuck in this fight or flight response, you actually develop neuroplasticity, meaning your brainstem gets really good at processing stress. And you're just always watching out for it and predicting for it. So even those simple things, although they can help buffer it, sometimes more directed practices are needed. And that's why a lot of what I spoke about before about the vagus nerve and activating your vagus nerve could be a fantastic way of resetting the brainstem. Yeah. So there you have it. Those are the top 3 most common root causes. And again, depends on which one it is for you. I gave you some examples of what to do about it. Great question.
Awesome. I think there might be some interest in this enema retreat. So we have a question here. So is it just a water enema? I've done a coffee enema before and found it helpful. I think there is, Ayurvedically, neurologically, there's a lot of different types of things you can do the enema with. So what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, great question. So when we're purely talking about using the enema as a way to activating your vagus nerve, it actually doesn't really matter so much what the liquid is in your enema bucket. It's because it's the stretch that creates that activation, that actually activates the vagus nerve. It's the stretch of your colon from the water in there. So that being said, I definitely wouldn't put cold water. So you'd want something warm and soothing. And yeah, when you add coffee, like organic coffee, that's regardless, the stretch is going to activate the vagus. But as you probably know, when you have the compound in caffeine can actually help with liver detoxification. So for my patients and clients, I actually personalize their enemas for them. I don't actually brew the coffee, but I give them the instructions. So for example, if someone has issues with detox, they feel sluggish a lot, maybe they have skin issues, brain fog, and I think they need activation of their vagus nerve, then I'll tell them, hey, you might want to try a coffee enema because that can help detox and activate the vagus nerve. Another example is I recommend probiotic enemas sometimes. So patients of mine who have chronic dysbiosis or gut issues, and I think they also need the vagus nerve stimulation, I'll recommend a probiotic enema, right? And that's what I mean. It's like when you can figure out the root cause for your health challenges and really get specific and intentional with it, like things can shift pretty quickly, I mean, quantum leaps in healing, right? Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean like we're done with the process because healing's a journey, right? But I've seen that over and over then. When we can get to the root cause, when I help my clients get to the root cause of which area of the nervous system's at the root cause for their symptoms, what other things, other factors, whether emotional or physical or chemical. And once we get to that and we create the perfect recipe for them, sometimes miracles can happen. So yeah, great question, Nicole. You can just use a water enema, right? But if you've already found that coffee enemas are helpful, right? Now you just understand, in addition to detox, it can help support vagus nerve.
Yeah, and I don't know, it was last month, a couple months ago, we did Ayurvedic medicine in our MindBody Club, and I know that they have a lot of really awesome practices in terms of doing different types of oils in the enema. So for somebody who's very vata like myself, I think it's recommended to do like a sesame oil enema and just different, constitution types as well. So finding,
that's awesome. Finding the right recipe.
Yeah.
So watch out. We're going to have a virtual retreat. We will help you personalize the right enema for you neurologically, biochemically, and Ayurvedically.
Oh, great questions, guys. Thanks for joining this. As always, we love to interact, to answer questions, all of that. But we're going to be having more of these resources up in the portal. You'll be able to download Dr. Chiu's guide to the vagus nerve and some additional stuff that we have for our MindBody Club members. All of that will be in the member portal. And I'll leave a link in the comments, too, for Dr. Chiu's vagus nerve for anybody else who's watching the replay. Thanks for joining us. It was great having you all. We will see you soon.
Go take your mini breaks.